You're listening to Scholé Sisters, episode number 70. Welcome to Scholé Sisters, the podcast for the classical homeschooling mama who seeks to learn and grow while she's helping her children learn and grow. Scholé Sisters is a casual conversation about topics that matter to those of us in the trenches of classical homeschooling who yearn for something more than just checking boxes and getting it all done. I'm your host, Brandy Wenzel. You can find me at Afterthoughts. That's where you'll find my thoughts on educational philosophy and homeschooling, as well as my Charlotte Mason study guides and workshops. My co-hosts today are Misty Winkler and Abby Wall. Misty is a second-generation homeschooler with 5 kids and too many projects. With her blog, podcast, and membership, she helps you organize your attitude so you can organize your life. Find her over at simplyconvivial.com. Abby is, as you know, the queen of the Scholé Sisters sistership. Abby is a country-living farmer and rancher, a loving wife, and mom of 5 who homeschools and reads whenever she can. I've been promising you a bonus episode for a while now, and today is the day. The only thing is, Abby made us do a Scholé Everyday, and then we talked too long. So we did the logical thing in this situation. We decided to make it a real episode. What does this mean for the season? Well, it'll just be longer. There will be 9 episodes instead of our usual 8, making this a sort of bonus after all. In today's episode, we discuss an article on education written by Stephen Rummelsburg that originally appeared in the Imaginative Conservative. It's called The Problem of Language and Our Schools. If you'd like to read the article before listening, you can grab a link to it at our show notes at scholésisters.com/SS70. This is a rousing conversation on an excellent topic. And also, listen up, because in this episode, we make a very big announcement. And so, without further ado, let's get to it. Let's start off with our Scholé Everyday. Who wants to go?
Abby does.
I do.
That's true.
Do.
It's her whole fault that we're having this.
Yes, it is. Okay. So I am reading the nonfiction title, Adorning the Dark by Andrew Peterson. It was on sale a while back on Audible. So I actually had or maybe it was on sale in Kindle. But anyway, I have it on Kindle. I have it on Audible. I've been walking a lot to relieve stress from the current events and listening to audiobooks. So Andrew Peterson also wrote the wonderful series, The Wing Feather Saga.
Mm-hmm. I love those so much.
He's a musician, and I like his attitude about creativity. And so this book is a lot about creativity, writing and songwriting and just doing creative work. Mm. Not being a naturally creative person, but actually doing the work of creative work and really putting in the time and effort to do it and how it's painful. He talks a lot about the suffering of writing and sitting down to write. And he has great examples, and he just talks about how humbling it is in his process and how as he's gotten older, he is just humbled over and over again by God's goodness to him and how these things unfold and how God gives him amnesia every time he thinks he's figured out a system of writing a song. And then God really 30 seconds later takes that away from him. So every time he's back to the drawing board and, praying and it's a painful process. So he has a lot of great, songs in there, poetry, book recommendations, but he has this wonderful quote, and he's talking about in this chapter, discernment and how discernment is so important and how basically the principle of exposure breeds taste, and how he was teaching his daughter and their family about good quality music. And he said that he would never sacrifice quality for moralizing messages. So just because it had Christian slapped on it doesn't mean that it was good. And just because it was necessarily secular made it inherently bad. And he goes through the theology of that and everything like that. So it's really interesting. But he quotes G.K. Chesterton, and it's about discernment. And he goes, the problem, according to G.K. Chesterton, is that all democracies eventually vote themselves out of existence. Long term, the majority won't choose what's best for it. The masses, or at least those who aspire don't aspire to any sense of discernment tend to choose the path of least resistance, which means that the most bankable art is often the most vapid, loveless. Noise, 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 a clanging cymbal. And I just love how he is bringing spiritual truths to art and truth and beauty and goodness. And so it's been some of the chapters I'm like, well, I don't know if that's really great, but then he really nails some other chapters. So, but I've gotten a lot out of it. So I definitely would recommend it. And it's a nice short book. So.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
I have that on my list of things to potentially buy at some point in the future.
I would recommend it.
Cool. Well, you want to go, Misty?
Okay. I will share my current whim title, which I think I bought because of the title, basically. And I think I might have confused who the author was. So it's called Mere Discipleship. And I don't know, it was one of those books that has ended up on my shelf, and I don't exactly remember how. But the author is Alistair McGrath. Okay. So it's possible that I thought it was Alistair Begg. So this book is a collection of mostly lectures that he's given in various contexts. And right now I'm trying to decide whether or not I keep going, because this was a whim title. And I picked it up because the 5x5 titles that I was in the middle of, and so I wouldn't let myself start any more of my 5x5 titles, are all pretty dense. And I needed something that was, I could read during basketball practice. And at those times where you just can't, it needs to be easier to consume. And it seemed like it might be that kind of book. He has good things to say. It's kind of like, I'm glad this book exists in the world, I suppose, but I don't know if I need to finish it. He has a great chapter in there on why we need creeds and confessions and catechisms.
Okay.
And it's really good, but he's definitely writing for an audience that is progressive academics. And it's drawing...
Not his target with.
Interestingly, while reading this essay that we're going to discuss, I thought about that book too, because just the way that academics use language.
Oh my word, yes.
And it's just in that, like, these are speeches that he's giving to grad students and postdocs and that crowd at Oxford, at Cambridge, those kind of contexts. So it's in their world terminology. And it is drawing them to what I think is solid Orthodox Christianity concepts. But yeah, I'm not the intended audience. I think it would be good to give to someone who is leaning liberal.
Interesting.
Because it's almost like convincing those leaning liberal and progressive to give the conservative historical view a chance. But it's just academic jargon, and just the way that they structure sentences and use words, it just drives me crazy. It irritates me.
Right.
So that's a little bit related to our topic today.
Yeah, it is.
How about you, Brandy?
What do you call it? To Kill a Mockingbird. Actually, I am reading it for the first time since high school, as far as I know. I mean, I don't remember reading it any time in my adult life, but my senior's reading it, so I'm reading it. I'm rereading it to read it with him. And I mean, I remember loving it in high school. Thought it was a fabulous book, but it is so interesting to read as an adult. And one of the reasons for that is because there are actually, it goes back to this essay we're going to discuss. There are so many slighting comments made about the new way of educating, and they call it the Dewey Decimal System. And she's constantly complaining that the Scout, the main character, that she just feels like surely nobody intended her to be doomed for 12 years, but she's pretty sure that's what's going to happen. And like the school won't let her read. She's gifted. The school won't let her read or write or, any place that she's advanced. They just want to step on her. And anyway, So she and her dad are secretly reading, but she's not supposed to tell the teacher because the teacher might get mad at him. So she sits on his lap in the evenings and they read, but she's not allowed to tell anybody that they do that because that's, the worst thing that you could do. It might be confusing to her if an adult reads to her that isn't her teacher. Anyway, the little comments about education, that wouldn't have stuck out to me as a high schooler, but are so interesting to me now. So it's kind of fun. I've been underlining them as we go and kind of compiling them. So anyway,
cool.
Fun little layer to add to my appreciation of that book.
It's on my 5x5 list and I have never read it.
Ooh.
What?
And I know, homeschooled.
Yeah.
My mom didn't, well, actually, so my senior year, is that when people read it?
I read it in 7th grade. That was when our classes went
I think
through
I
it.
was a sophomore. I felt like it was earlier high school, but I was definitely in high school.
Okay. Well, anyway, I didn't
Yeah,
read
they
it.
probably do it again in American Lit. I skipped American Lit, so.
I'm looking forward to it. I saw the movie.
Great.
You'll really like it. It's good. It's really good. It's gotten fun too. We're at the, we're getting going. So it's good. Okay. Should we transition?
Yep.
All right. So we are today we're discussing The Problem of Language in Our Schools by Stephen Rummelsburg. And we chose this. Can I say it now? Can I say the exciting part now? Da-da-da! We chose this.
Drum roll.
Stephen Rummelsburg is going to come do our spring training for Scholé Sisters this year. We are so excited. I've been in contact with him and I feel like he is a match made in heaven for this project. I mean, just as we've talked with him, I can't get over how perfect of a fit he seems to be. And he even said that he wanted to go watch what we were given last year so that he can make sure he's building on what we already know, but not making assumptions of things we don't already know or whatever. And so like, he's actually going to take the time to look at what we've been taught. So yeah, I'm super excited.
Nice. Wow. So Brandy, explain who he is and what he's going to talk about, because I didn't know who he was.
Okay.
When you first mentioned it.
Okay. So Stephen Rummelsburg, I actually had been reading him in The Imaginative Conservative, but hadn't realized that he was the same person that I had heard on a podcast interview on the Matt Fradd show. When I was listening, it didn't dawn on me that this was the essayist that I had liked, which was kind of funny when I realized, oh, that's all the same person. But I listened to him speaking on the Matt Fradd show, and he was just so interesting to me. So he was a secular humanist for a very long time. Okay, funny trivia. I did not pick him because he was local to me, but turns out he's from here.
Really?
He's from here and his wife is from here. It's just so funny in talking to him. I found him on Facebook when I was trying to track him down. Turns out he's from here. He doesn't live here now, but he's from here. So he was a secular humanist who, I don't know his whole story, and I don't know if how much of it he's going to share as he's teaching us or anything, but he somehow became friends / he was mentored by Louis Marcus. And then he eventually ended up converting to Christianity. He became Catholic. So the interesting thing about him that stuck out to me in the interview was, number one, how he had such an excellent grasp of modern education, the dichotomy between modern education and traditional classical education. He really understood the differences, which is basically what we're walking through today, right? He's delineating those differences. But the second thing is, I felt like he had these categories for thinking about things that most of us didn't have. And so that's what I asked him to teach us. I just told them, basically, I was noticing him using these categories to have really interesting conversations, and I think would bring about a lot of growth in our students, but also in each other if we could talk this way with each other when we're in the sistership. And so I asked him, like, can you please bring these categories and teach them to us? And I noticed that a number of them were lifted from Aristotle, but I had never heard them used in this particular way. So I don't have the class outlines or anything yet, but that's what we're going for with him. That's what I've asked him to do, is to help us have some more categories for thinking so that we can have these better conversations that will be just more life-giving, more fruitful conversations. I kind of got off track from who he is. He is currently a teacher at John Adams Academy. So John Adams Academies are a system of charter schools in Northern California that are classical. So they're public charter schools, but they are using a classical methodology. And so he is free to have these really awesome conversations. So I think he teaches Aristotle. I can't remember. He can tell us more sometime. I'm super excited to have him. I think he's going to really up our game when it comes to being able to have a good conversation.
Well, and it goes to what we are trying to do, right? We're trying to read widely, and that 5x5 challenge right now, reading widely, and then think deeply and apply actively. So thinking deeply, Misty and I were talking about this the other day. It's the most abstract and it's the most vague because how do we actually learn to think deeply and how do we do this? Right. So I think this is going to be great because this is actually putting some practical ideas towards this vague idea. So this tools so that we can use that. So I think it's great to have someone who has been thinking and teaching this way for a long time. So I think it's great. I'm looking forward to it.
I am too. I really felt like one of the things that was lacking in my own ability to have discussions is that I don't think I'm always asking the right questions. Mm-hmm. So we're not even having really the right discussion because I'm not asking the right questions. And that was one of the things I observed with him in this interview that I heard, where I just felt like he understands what the best questions are to ask. What are the best ways to think about this? Because really, if you think about thinking through things, you're asking yourself questions and you're answering them, right? It's sort of like this internal Socratic dialogue. And so many times my inability to feel like I've thought through is actually picking up on the idea that there's this whole area that I haven't even touched on because of my own ignorance.
Well, and thinking is actually really hard to do. Have either of you read the Alan Jacobs book? It's How to Think. Have you read it yet, Misty?
I own it, but I have not read it.
Okay. So I just started it a while back, and he just talks about how there's actually more language talking about how our thoughts go awry and have errors than actual thinking have like the right path. So it's really hard to do. But so I'm really looking forward to this. So Alan Jacobs has some great books, and this one was what I've read about a quarter of it, and it's been delightful so far.
Well, I just wrote it down. It looks like I'm going to be the one to make this an official podcast episode because I don't own it and I might need to buy it. So, my last hurrah before they shut down Amazon and I can't buy a book for a year. So,
talk about doom and gloom.
Jeez.
Seriously, I'm feeling a little gloomy today. What can I say?
Do we need to start holding a boombox with "It's the End of the World as We Know It"? Brandy?
Yeah, really.
That's a pop culture reference.
I do,
Misty.
Listen, I do really like that song, so feel free.
It's by REM. There you go, Misty. You can look it up.
I think I've heard that before.
Okay, so the article, we thought it would be fun to kind of introduce everyone to Stephen Rummelsburg by discussing one of his wonderful essays that he's written for the Imaginative Conservative over the years. And so this one is called The Problem of Language and Our Schools. And the whole essay, article, whatever we want to call it, is basically drawing lines between the modern way of thinking about education, which would include the academics that Misty was complaining about earlier, and then the traditional / real way of educating, if you will. I don't know about you guys. I actually took a piece of paper and drew a line down the middle and had 2 columns, and I was trying to write on each side, like this side is the modern side, and this side is our classical education, real education, traditional, whatever we want to call it. This is the other side. This is our side. Go team. And I was trying to write out the little contrast that he was making as we were going. So, but let's just kind of walk through it and talk about it. I thought we'd start in, first paragraph. And I just have to say, the very first thing I underlined was not the quote at the top, because that was like a pull quote, but the actual real first paragraph was, I loved this line. As is said in Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. The way he should go is his education.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I just wanted to frame it. Let's make a printable for this one because sometimes we overthink that.
One of the things I pulled out in the first paragraph, so I had a highlighter and right away.
Was it purple? I need to know.
No,
was it
sorry,
purple?
it was pink, but it's only
so
because
disappointing.
I know, I'm sorry. I was disappointed also, but I didn't bother getting up from my chair to go get the right color.
Oh, understood.
It's laziness. It's pink.
It was lazy Scholé.
Yeah. So the first thing I noticed before I was through with the second sentence was his use of the words real, authentic, right, proper, true. In the first paragraph, he uses all of those words multiple times.
Yes.
It's so judgy.
Yeah. Well, actually, it reminded me of Norms and Nobility.
Yes.
It's normative. And that's what he's trying to get at here. And I think that's why he's using them so often. Even, this is something I tell my writing students not to do, but he uses those same words in the same sentence. The right use of speech, the right use of reason, proper view, proper philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's deliberate because I'm pretty sure he does have a broad enough vocabulary to not rely on a single adjective throughout his writing. That means it's significant. And then he did end up using the word normative near the end.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
Yep.
I underlined that.
Yeah. True, again, there's that word again. True higher order thinking skills are normative as opposed to subjective.
Yes.
And so right from the get-go, he is setting up that contrast and almost inviting you to step back and say, whoa, because we just are not used to people being honest enough to speak this way.
Right.
And he also uses paideia too, not the word, but the concept.
Mm-hmm.
So I picked that up too. So the conceptual recovery of the word education would be a return to the notion that an education is the transmission of culture and the way in which children are led from darkness of error into the light of truth. And I think that's the one that they pulled up to highlight at the top.
Yeah.
I really liked that.
Yeah, it is. And that's paideia.
Yeah.
Well, and that is also, hold on. That's actually the literal definition of educare, if I remember, like in the Latin, which appears in Ephesians 6:4.
Right. It's within the same verse that has paideia, right?
Yes.
Nurture and admonition.
Admonition. Yep.
There's almost like a Plato's cave too, though.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
That's there. This idea of coming out towards the light and not being just stuck down in the darkness, thinking that we know things, right? Because that's the whole thing, is that people are willingly staying in the cave.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yes.
Now, there were a few spots where I thought he was a little bit academia-y.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Those sentences that stuck out to me as, okay, this is academic speak, which is funny because that's kind of what he is opposed to in the whole essay.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, the worst sentence was actually a quote.
Yeah.
So we can't blame him.
Can't fault him for it.
Yeah, it's the Vogelin. Is that how you say his name? Vogelin?
We'll go with that.
It says, there are two contexts, the intellectual pursuit of truth and the political arena. That's the part that was clear.
Yes.
And that was his words. Okay. Which is the one that here we go. These acts of verbal creation are just as much political battles as are the concrete manifestations of the struggle, including physical confrontations. So I paraphrased that in the margin as terminology is war.
Oh, I like that.
The words you use are just as much a part of the battle. It's the battle for definition of the words.
I feel like I get very muddled because something's happening at school. Like, I don't want to pretend that kids go to school and they don't do anything. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so, but then we use all these words and it's the same words that I'm using to describe what I'm doing. And there is even some crossover between what I'm doing in a day. Like if we just look at the what is done, there are definite crossovers, right? Like I did math today, and so did the kids that are home from public school down the street, just doing what they were told by the school to do. We all did math. So then drawing a contrast becomes really tricky.
It does.
because the similarity is not just in language, it's also in some practices.
Sure.
And yet at the end of the day, we're like, we know that the education given not just by the public schools, but by a lot of private schools is not normative in nature.
Right.
Which makes it not classical, not traditional, whatever we want to call it, not real, not real and true, if we're going to use his words. I think that's why this essay is helpful, because it is really hard to tease all that out and to make the contrast that he's making, which obviously he would know because he used to be on one side.
Right.
And now he's on the other. So he actually lived, he talks a lot about Bloom's taxonomy, which was super hard for me because I'm not really familiar with that.
I knew about this. Yeah, I remember it. And, it looks good on paper. Like it,
it does.
If you are thinking through it, right, to remember, to understand, to apply, to analyze, to evaluate, to create, right? Those all sound like quality learning, objectives, if we can say.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But, they're so compartmentalized. I think as human beings, we actually love to categorize and,
dissect,
qualify and name, right? We love this. I mean, it's exactly what the first job was, is naming and classifying and, putting things in their box. But at the same time, too, that is not how you actually know something just because you can name it, right? It's the Grand Dickens, Grand Grime, right?
Grand Grind.
Yes.
Yes. Still reading that.
Yeah,
Yes.
It's similar to that, but these things, if you look at their categories underneath of like what those words entail, like it's very, very limiting. It's not freedom, and it doesn't necessarily get you to a transcendent truth. It tells you facts. And he is talking about the difference between, well, and he calls it, right, that schools are using the political, right? Isn't that what it says? Mm-hmm. Sorry, I lost my place. But the political language and then the political arena rather than the intellectual pursuit of truth. So it's like the transcendent versus the very small number of facts that is knowable. So.
Right.
Yeah.
And even in the naming of the categories in Bloom's, I think one of the things he's drawing out there is that you can understand those words in different ways, but Bloom means something materialistic.
Yes.
And he's trying to turn it into scientifically quantifiable, which those categories really aren't. Like creativity is a part of coming to know something, is a way of putting knowledge into action, but it isn't materialistic and it isn't measurable either. It's not testable.
Yeah. And he's diminishing it to a purely qualitative or quantitative rather than a qualitative, right? We can quantitate, doing these things, but how do you, to get to a goal, to reach a certain reading level or a mathematic level, right? You test out of it, things like that. But to actually to know, understand, and love something like math is a qualitative thing. And it's not, it can't be measured, right? So
yeah. Anything that leaves out the spiritual component of humans is wrong. And I think that's what even people who do agree that there's a spiritual side will hardly go that far.
So here's the other thing too, is this Bloom's taxonomy, right? It is making all sorts of qualitative or quantitative claims, eliminating qualitative, right? Transcendent truth. And yet so much of the political language that our schools are using are about feelings and subjective truths and your own personal feelings about things. So it's kind of odd, but it's become a political stance rather than, but we're making it secular. And so anything that is Christian or religious in nature has to be eliminated from it. So
I think the reason for that is what he gets into near the end, which is the focus of the taxonomy is on self. And so it produces a student who is self-referential
Right.
rather than
Yes.
referential to some objective truth or some objective reality. And I think that's what you're getting to. That actually is what struck me. When I started really looking at Bloom's taxonomy, and I sent you a link. I found this page where it was broken down and sort of revised for how they're using it now in the classrooms or at teacher school or whatever. What struck me more than this idea that it was quantitative, because I will say, and the thing that I found, everything actually didn't seem quantitative to me. Most of it did. But a few things I was like, well, some of this does seem a little bit more qualitative, but it was completely subjective and it was completely self-centered.
Yes.
I mean, both things are dangerous because defining reality a la Gradgrind as facts, nothing but facts is very dangerous. But defining reality as my truth and your truth is also very dangerous. And I really think some of that's coming from this, because the whole thing was just reflect on me, create my thing, my, you know?
Yeah.
Right.
And he talks about the taxonomy is ideologically. I can't say the word driven. But
more sugar. She needs more sugar.
I do. It's the problem. But it's the ideology that is promoted by the taxonomy is not freeing, but constricting by the fact that the limits of that thinking are defined by quantifiable ideas instead of the reality of knowable objects. So,
let's talk about that a little bit more, because I thought that was very interesting. We talk a lot about the liberal arts being liberating in some way, that this was actually an angle on it that I hadn't considered before, that because it is referencing anything knowable, the liberal arts are interested in knowing the things that are knowable. There is a freedom in that because it's bigger than you could ever know. And so it's not, you're only limited by your own like time, effort, ability, whatever, you know what I mean? Like that is huge when you think about it. And he's saying that modern education is constricting and I think we'd say illiberal.
Yes, that's what
precisely because it's self-referential, because you're limited to just you and your own little petty world that you build for yourself. I thought that was really interesting. That's not an angle on liberal arts that I've ever really thought about before, but it does make perfect sense. When I get into a really selfish mood where I am essentially self-referential all day long, I am very limited in my abilities to live a very human life. You know?
Yeah. It was interesting. Was it a year or two ago? Whenever I was reading History of the American People by Paul Johnson, and I think he was getting into, it was even before Lincoln, but it was even Jefferson. Anyway, one of the presidents really early on. And Paul Johnson uses the word ideological as a negative. Say, the president was acting ideologically. And I realized he's using that as a negative. And I'm not sure I have heard it used in a pejorative way, unless it's by a liberal or something where it's like you have an idea of the way things ought to be that you're inflicting on someone else. And so I noticed that here too, that he's using it that way. It's ideological instead of authentic human intellection, he says.
Mm-hmm.
And so I forget, there was another, it was Paul Johnson. Now I'm reading The Modern World by Paul Johnson. He was contrasting in Modern World, Einstein coming up with theories and Marx and Freud coming up with theories. And Marx and Freud were ideological. That is, they had an idea of what they wanted the end result to be. Like they had this ideal and they were reasoning toward the ideal, and anything that didn't move them that direction, they rejected or contradicted. So they were only accepting information and theories that fit in the plan that they already wanted to promote. Whereas Einstein had a theory, recognized it as a theory, and was looking for ways to disprove it to see if it was true. And that's true science. And that is what if you really want to know and test that, that's the proper attitude towards research.
Yeah.
So Einstein was interested in reality.
Right.
And Marx thought he could manufacture reality.
Yes.
So he viewed himself
when you think about a maker of the world. Yeah.
Exactly. So he viewed himself as a god.
Yeah.
Really, if that's the case.
Well, and Viktor Frankl was a big critic of Freud as well. And he was a practicing psychologist who helped tens of thousands of people that were suicidal. And he just said that he did not believe what Freud thought, which was that, man's a hedonist, essentially, that they're only seeking their own gratification. Whereas Viktor Frankl said, no, man is in search of meaning. And that comes in many different forms. And if you can get people to, believe they have a purpose and a meaning, then Freud is full of it. And he actually helped thousands of people with severe depression, clinical depression.
Yeah.
So
the trouble now is that we accept that Freud was wrong and that people need meaning. And so the answer is make your own meaning. And it becomes self-referential again here instead of going to, there is, if there is a spiritual reality, that means that there's a God. There can't be spirituality without a creator.
Yes.
And that means that there are standards outside of us.
Yes, it's not the little God within me that I serve. It's
right.
That the hedonist God inside me that desires things.
That's not reality.
No.
And so we aren't actually trying to find reality. We're trying to make reality.
Yeah.
It reminded me a little bit of the Plato that we just read for the episode with Renee. Just because Plato was asking people to prove him wrong. That's what he was seeking.
Oh, yeah.
In the questions, he said, don't just hear me out. Can you prove me wrong? Ask me questions. Let's see if we can prove this wrong in any way, then it's wrong. If we want to know the truth, let's try this proposition and see if it holds any water.
Yeah.
So some of this political symbols as opposed to seeking truth is that act of trying to make reality. It tried to set up our own systems of the way things work instead of discovering the way things actually work. It's creating ways for things to work.
I wonder if that's why government social programs are always judged by their intentions rather than their results. Because we're actually pretending to be gods and we think we could just make it. So we don't really need to look at the results because we could just make things happen. I mean, I wonder if it really is that simple. I don't know. That's kind of interesting. Okay, he talks in this article about we need to recover definitions because we're using the same language, but we don't mean the same thing. And he, at the very end, he lists everything: literacy, grammar, logic, rhetoric, beauty, critical thinking, even the word education itself. The one that he really goes into is critical thinking. He talks about that one a little bit more, mainly because Bloom's seems to represent what people mean by critical thinking, which I found interesting because I feel like people just use that. What they mean is you should think longer than just your knee jerk. I felt like it was just a colloquial term almost. I didn't realize it was a real thing.
There are curriculum. Even when I was being homeschooled, there were all kinds of critical thinking curriculum where critical thinking was in the name, instead of logic. Really,
right.
It's like practical logic or something. But I remember, so critical thinking always makes me think of little workbooks with puzzles in them. My parents bought a few.
Well, looking at this revised Bloom's taxonomy, I could see how it could become a little workbook, really. It's already a grid. All you need is a blank grid for someone to fill it in. So what are the two definitions? I mean, I would like to try to tease out this contrast because he actually tries to tell us
So critical thinking versus higher order thinking skills.
He's saying we both use this word. Both columns, if I was to make my little columns, both columns use this word. But if our side's the real side, then real critical thinking is not what the other side means when they say critical thinking. He says, what the secular modern schools mean by critical thinking and what we ought to mean by critical thinking have become two radically different ideas. So I still felt a little bit hazy. So what do we mean? What do we mean by critical thinking? And what do they mean by critical thinking? And how are these things different?
Well, for the real kind, he uses the word reflective and to reflect multiple times.
Okay.
And the objective reality of things. Whereas the Bloom's version, he calls a psychological term, and then later therapeutic, with therapeutic value. He says a psychological term that means that you think about your own thinking.
Which is metacognition, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's another way of being self-referential, right? You're still thinking about yourself. You're maybe looking at yourself, thinking about yourself, but it's all about yourself. Instead of being reflective of the objective reality of things. So that reminded me of Scholé, the poetic knowledge where you're like losing yourself. You're not really, there's no self-reference when you're just paying attention to what's actually around you. And how you feel about it doesn't define anything,
Yeah.
It's not about you, it's about the thing. No matter what you end up seeing, you're not going at the thing with an agenda. You're just letting it be and observing.
So is it more about observation versus opinion? And observation doesn't necessarily tie my own personal agenda or thoughts to it, but just what I've observed. And then the materialist or the progressive, right? It's my opinion about the thing. It's making a critical judgment.
I think so, except I think that when they talk about critical thinking, they definitely don't mean your opinion. I think you're supposed to be getting away from your opinion or noticing that what you think is just your opinion. It's analysis.
Okay.
But it's analysis of yourself. And I think what it neglects is just how easily self-deceived we are.
Interesting.
So even if I step back and observe that I have an opinion about something and that what I'm thinking is just my opinion, that doesn't mean that what I think after that is any closer to the truth.
Okay, so how do you even have conversations with people about this if they aren't recognizing that there's objective reality? I mean, we're at that point, right? Where there are people that are just who are in education or who other things, right?
Well, yeah, if you can't objectively say that a girl is a girl and a boy is a boy, I think we've definitely gone way too far to have a rational conversation in culture in general. But I think even with people who would say, of course, there is objective reality, we might still be uncomfortable applying that everywhere. I mean, just have you ever had any conversations about beauty being objective?
Yes.
I had an argument with my husband about that one time.
Or art.
Yeah. And even, I did a little bit ago with some of my kids and, they're homeschooled. We've been pretty sheltered and they've been exposed to all kinds of beautiful things and only good art and all of this stuff. But we got into this discussion. I said, okay, here. And I did a Google search for modern art and just did, Google images, screened it first, like make sure it was appropriate and showed it to them and said, so what I'm saying, what I'm saying is that all of this is ugly. And they said, well, you think it's ugly. I said, no, I'm saying it is ugly. And it's very uncomfortable to go that far.
Well, for some of us more than others, because I feel like you're not that uncomfortable.
No, I'm
Yeah.
not. No. Give me the argument. I'll take it all the way. But if you, a lot of conversations end up they go to those ultimate definitions. And I think that the faster we can get to those root issues, like any conversation about worship music, about these things that are applications or conversations we might just end up in, if we keep them on those topical levels, they don't really go anywhere. And that's because the fundamental disagreement or discord that you're just kind of talking around and not exposing is at that fundamental level of, is beauty, is truth, is reality, is the spiritual, are all of those things objective and real or not?
Yeah.
Maybe really what we can get out of this essay is that talking about education is probably like a level too high.
Right.
That we need to dig down deeper into. Because usually when we talk, I guess what I'm thinking is like when you talk with someone about education, lots of times you're actually talking about implementation of a philosophy. You're not really usually talking philosophy unless you've got a bunch of classical homeschoolers together, then of course they are. But I'm just saying, like in general, when you encounter a teacher, there's this like, well, I do that too. We do, like, it's about what you do.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering if really what he's telling us is, if you want to be persuasive and make room for this real education in the world, that's the wrong discussion to have.
Mm-hmm. Does it make a difference in your math class whether or not God exists? And if it doesn't, then that's where the problem is.
Yeah, but you have a whole school system that has barred God from the classroom, the math class.
Right, which is why it will never be education.
So what would we call it instead?
Or it is enculturation. It's enculturation in a culture that says, if God exists, he doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's just personal. Doesn't make any difference to knowing of anything. And that's not reality. And so how can we expose the fact that those assumptions are there and at odds with reality? I'm reading Francis Schaeffer right now, and that's kind of one of his things that he comes back to is, true truth, the God who is there. Mm-hmm. Coming back, like just bringing it down to fundamental categories of existence, basically. This isn't a secondary or just personal religious decision or idea. If this is true, if Christianity is true, it's true whether or not you believe it. And it's true that this is the way the world works, no matter what else you think. Your opinion or your belief isn't what makes it true. And it isn't even what makes it relevant. If it's true, it's actually always relevant.
As we wrap it up, I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this. I'm going to name his differentiation that he says here, and then I want to name an objection, and I want to hear your guys' responses to this, because here is where I think your everyday mom and dad struggle. So the quote is the quote that's at the very beginning. It's the pull quote at the beginning, but it's from later on in the essay. And he says, the word education itself has become a political symbol co-opted by a secular government to mean career and college training for the sake of a mechanized society. A theoretical and conceptual recovery of the word education would be a return to the notion, and you read this earlier, Abby, that an education is the transmission of culture and the way in which children are led from the darkness of error into the light of truth. So when you make that differentiation, though, between college and career training and transmitting culture and darkness of light, I always hear parents say, but my child needs to grow up, especially if he's a boy, provide for his family. So he needs college and career. He has to be college and career ready. And so that's what I need for him. So how do you respond to that?
Well, I have two thoughts on this. One is my children have been taught how to have a work ethic. And I know that everyone has that opportunity because we are an agricultural family. And so my children know how to work hard. And I will say that most people who can show up and work hard and be go-getters, I guess is the way to say it, will probably not have a hard time finding a job. My husband's offered jobs lots of times. He did a little bit of community college, a couple classes, but he will never want for work, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But he had an education that was different because he was homeschooled. And he thinks about things differently. And he is able to problem solve better than almost anyone I've met. He can talk and have conversations with people who have had lots of experience in career training and educational levels. One of his family members went to Harvard for grad school, and he doesn't have a problem, going toe to toe with her. And they are very different opinions. So I also think that we absolutely have no idea what the future holds for jobs at this point. The technology is changing at such a rapid rate that I don't know if they can even, most of the careers that we have now weren't even a thought, 25, 30 years ago. So, I just don't know how we do that. I feel like we're almost in horse and buggy days, and we don't know we can't even imagine an automobile. There are just some things that we have no idea. So having an education that teaches them to think and to be able to want an education and to desire to learn will outpace, and to work hard for it, right? To actually put in the effort, the mental effort and the time will outpace it. But I
think that's all key, because all of those statements that you made are true. And those are statements based on the reality of the way the world actually works, regardless of careers.
Yeah.
Whereas the idea that we have to have specialized education for the careers, those are all categories that the educational specialists, that's their definition of the conversation. Like, we're letting them have their ideological way when we let them define words like that. Where, they will say, you have to do this so that you know how to think. But we know that they are not teaching people how to think. They're teaching people how to conform.
Yes.
But they would say the same thing, so that you can do the job, so that you can, have critical thinking skills. But we just know that they're wrong. But that is a political agenda, and we need to not let them set the definitions and the agenda. Because they're trying to define reality, but we know that it is counter to the real, true reality, that we don't have to worry about it. If we are conforming to truth in reality, then we will always outpace them and beat them in the end. Because the world actually works the way God made it to work. Nothing anyone can do about that.
Part of this, I think, especially what you said, Abby, reminded me of that C.S. Lewis quote where he says, "Aim at heaven, you will get earth thrown in. Aim at earth, and you will get neither."
Yeah.
And he's talking more about Christians being effective in this world and all that. But just pulling out the principle of that, it's almost like you're aiming at the small thing instead of the big thing, because it's not like they're completely mutually exclusive. You right. Just told us, Abby, that your husband was educated XYZ way and he doesn't have a problem in his career. So we know that at least it's possible, to get a more traditional type of education and still successfully provide for your family and live a happy life and get married and all the things that all we parents, worry about when it comes to the details we worry about when it comes to launching children. We know that as we're aiming just for college and career readiness, we are getting an increasingly inferior student.
And an inferior adult. Because not only have we put so much pressure on scholastic achievement, we've put basically no value on being able to wash your own clothes, clean up after yourselves, cook your own meals, because that is not valued. I love what Rebecca Merkel says. She says, we need to be, for women, highly educated and home-centered. But no one is home centered. It's always career oriented. My boys will know how to clean up after themselves, and they will not, even if they are working outside the home, they will at least know how to clean up after themselves for their wives. So, right, there are valuable things. My husband is great at cleaning, actually, and he does laundry on a regular basis and things like that. But that's because his mother, that was part of their homeschooling, is they prioritized caring for their jurisdictions, is what they call it. They had their own like areas that they were assigned and things like that. So those are important things too.
Well, I'm even thinking just character-wise. Like I've seen a bunch of people freaking out that millennials don't seem to be taking this virus very seriously. And, we can talk about whether or not it should be taken as seriously as it is being taken.
Yeah.
But the reality is that the not taking it seriously seems to be more of like an I don't care about other people than well, I just think this is overblown. Like the stuff that I've read that has been, and with all the fake news, it's so hard to know. Like, are people just being hard on millennials or whatever, but I mean, just the attitude of like, I don't want to be inconvenienced for the sake of others is concerning. Anyway, but I'm thinking like, well, if our whole education, to bring it back to where we started, is self-referential, then why would you? Because your thoughts and your feelings are what mattered, and they are the content of your education. So maybe that's the logical outcome of a self-referential education, is to have people who make self-referential decisions.
Right.
Not that classical education is the magic bullet that will solve all selfishness because, sin, but still, it's an interesting thing to think about how maybe this thing that people are upset by is actually a result of the schools they, just shut down. So is my cynicism coming out today?
Do you need more vitamin D? You need a little more sunshine in your life?
I think if I just had one more pack of toilet paper, I'd be good. Just kidding. Oh.
But we see that in the self-care type thing too, where it comes back to those kind of categories with, I can't do anything for others unless I'm taking care of myself first. And taking care of myself first means doing what makes me feel good. Like if that's the reasoning process, you can see how that would affect even crisis times, where to take care of myself means to let myself have my way and be self-indulgent. We let ourselves say, I need this in order to function. And anyone who tells me I can't have it is being toxic in my life. It's coming back to the self-referential. I define what's good for me. No one else can.
Well, and what he talks about, and I was just thinking about this, we're apt to confuse the distinction between the proper order of thought and the political order. And I was just thinking about proper order, and I was just thinking, well, he's probably talking about, the ordo amoris, right? Our rightly ordered affections, right? That we are in alignment with God, in alignment with truth, and how we are doing these things. It has to come back to the fact that reality does testify that there is a creator, and I am not him.
That's the truth. Well, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Maybe we even have episode bonuses. Lots of
yeah. I actually think we might.
Feel free to take my rants out.
Oh, take all my rants out.
Wait, so you guys want to make an episode interesting and then remove? I'm trying to understand your philosophy of production.
To you guys, don't send it to me.
Hey guys, Abby got her own Scholé Sisters email address.
Yeah.
You can guess what it is.
Yeah.
So I'll leave it at that. But if you misbehave next time, I'm going to announce it in full. So all right. Well, thanks for meeting with me during the apocalypse. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of the sisterhood of the podcast. Make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss any of the episodes coming out this season. Every episode has a Scholé sheet, and this episode is no exception. At Scholé Sisters, we want to be people who apply what we learn rather than just listening and forgetting. Scholé sheets are individual journal pages to help you apply the ideas from the episode. Download your Scholé sheet for free from our show notes at scholésisters.com/SS70. That's SS70. Also, it's time to register for Spring Training 2020. This is your chance to learn from the author of today's article, Stephen Rummelsburg himself. Spring Training will take place 3 Monday evenings in May, the 11th, 18th, and 25th. These will be live sessions, but if you can't make the time, replays will be available. There are 2 ways to register for Spring Training, so listen up. You can either buy it individually at scholésisters.com/springtraining, or, even better, become a Sophie and get Spring Training included with your membership. Just go to scholésisters.com/sistership to sign up. Next episode, Misty and Pam go rogue and dare to do an interview without me. I may be disgruntled that I missed out, but trust me when I say this was all for your benefit because they interviewed the one and only Andrew Pudewa. This is an episode you do not want to miss. Until then, we want to remind you once again that homeschooling is a marathon. You needn't run alone, so open up your eyes and look around you. Find your sisters. They went out with a list of like 5 things we really needed, and all they came home with, by the way, was a block of cheese. Maybe we should, I don't know, record our episode.
His love language is workaholism, so.